Hello! In this video we're going to talk about the Superman archetype. Now obviously that's not the same thing as like the man who like rips open his shirt and there's a big old red S. It's someone who has like these maxed out stats, if you want to think of it that way. So for example, Aragorn. Aragorn is a pretty decent example, at least in terms of fighting, because this is sort of a sword channel. So he's a swordsman and he's a really proficient fighter. Now he is a Superman because you can just like plop him in the middle of a battlefield with nothing but like a torch, right? Or like just like even something ridiculous, like you can just like plop him in the middle with a wooden ladle or just his pinkies or something like that, and he'd be able to wipe out all the orcs. No real problem. Like you're not afraid he's gonna get hurt, even if there are like literally thousands of them. He's just gonna kill them one at a time. Just because he's Aragorn, and you can't beat him. Can't beat him in the fight. He's Aragorn. So in that case, he has like these maxed out stats in terms of his fighting prowess. He's also capable of a bunch of other things, but he doesn't need to have multiple things he's really good at. But in general, a Superman is going to have at least one attribute that's just completely maxed out. A couple other examples are going to be characters like Sherlock Holmes and James Bond. So Sherlock Holmes, his intelligence, his perception, and his ability to piece things together, completely maxed out, right? Like you can like sneeze and blatantly lie to his face, and he'll be able to like, oh, based on the pressure of like the exhalation, I know you're trying to deceive me, so therefore what you're trying to say is in fact the opposite of whatever. Right? Like he is like the god of perception and integration and stuff like that. Just like with James Bond. James Bond is really good at whatever James Bond does, right? Because I've totally watched at least one film of James Bond. I'm assuming, right? Because like he's really charismatic, right? So his charisma is like off the charts. He's a really good shot with his gun, and all these other things. So these are all examples of that archetype. So let's talk about that specific archetype from different perspectives. Why would you want to write the archetype? So I'm going to attack this from the writer's perspective, from a reader's perspective, from a narrative perspective, and if there's anything else we can also add those. I'll add all those together. But from a writer's perspective, why would you want a Superman? There are obviously going to be a few ways you can interpret this. Now obviously some people like to write Superman because it gives us a little bit of sense of control, right? Like, oh, like I can write about a character who can, fight off like 1,000 enemies and not be hurt. I feel, better and all that fun stuff. That's a little bit more on the superficial level. Like, all right, so the writer might get, some satisfaction of having a character who's just good at stuff, right? But again, that's superficial, not interesting. So let's just keep going from there. By having a Superman, or super person, because it can obviously be a man or a woman or anything in between, you can also have ways of giving out information. So for example, if you want to think about like Hermione Granger in terms of the Harry Potter series, she is a super person in terms of knowledge and history, right? And even if she doesn't have the knowledge and history at the moment, she's going to figure it out, right? Like there's no reason that she's not going to. So from a writer's perspective, if you have a super person, they can solve problems for you if you're having a hard time either presenting the information or you're in a situation where like, I can't get out of this, right? So for example, if you do have a super person fighter and you're kind of like write yourself into a corner in terms of like all right, I accidentally have it such that all three potential options to get out of this situation end in like total party knockout, or total party kill, or something like that. Like, I need a Deus Ex Machina. I need like something to help me through this. So super persons are really good at that because they can just solve problems that otherwise are just really impossible. Taking an idea from Brandon Sanderson online, so if you go to YouTube and search a Brandon Sanderson lecture, he talks about this a few times, I think in terms of his hard versus soft magic systems, but limitations are actually where things get interesting, right? So this is just something for you to keep in mind if you do want to write a Superman character, is that inherently limitations are just more interesting for you as a writer and also as a reader. But you can have the best of both worlds. You can have someone who is a Superman in these perspectives, but a complete novice or very, very limited in other portions as well. So for example, what the BBC version of Sherlock is tried to convey is someone could be like hyper smart, hyper able to like make connections and perceive things, but socially inept, right? Now obviously in the actual book, so in the source material, Sherlock Holmes is really kind of a Superman, right? He's charismatic, he's smart, he's he knows how to navigate certain ways, he's also a decent fighter. I think he's a prized boxer, and also like he knows how to use a cane or something like that. I forget what it was. Right? So by adding those limitations, it doesn't take away from anything in particular, but like you can still be a super person in terms of certain things, but limited in others. And that contrast, again, contrasts are going to be like the biggest thing you want to think about in terms of your characters. That contrast is going to be a lot more interesting for you to write and also for others to read. Writing a super person is also going to be okay, right? If you don't really want that much character growth, right? So if your story is about a certain plot, or it could be, an allegory for something or something along those lines, by all means, absolutely fine, right? Because super persons are going to be able to progress plot super easily, right? So for example, if everything is supposed to be like a metaphor for so I guess, is this really? I'm thinking something like Candide, where like the idea is just to like hammer the point home that bad things happen, right? Specifically for Candide, bad things happen, although there's a god, allegedly. So you can have like a super character, so a super person, like in this case, like the character Candide is like super amazing at finding every single instance of bad things happening. Right? But it definitely hammers a point home, right? You can write a super person with the intent of having a thematic reasoning behind your book. You can also do it if you want like an allegorical thing. You can do it in terms of just having an interesting plot. They just want to tell the story of the plot, right? Maybe there's something about like a really interesting magic system that you're like, I really want this magic system. I want to explain it in such a way that it's just awesome, it's cool. By all means, have someone who's really awesome at that magic. I guess because I already mentioned Harry Potter. If you want to think about something like Dumbledore, who's just like magically superpowered, right? Although she doesn't do this in the books, but something that would have been kind of interesting is just like enjoying the use of magic, right? Have Dumbledore like have that giant fiery inferno and then like lightning and like pretty much be a god on earth. Like that can be just really fun for you as a writer to write, because it's kind of like a little bit of a fulfillment kind of thing, right? You get to like inhabit a character who's just like so powerful, but also it's just like interesting to read. What about for readers, right? Because we generally produce things for them to be enjoyed by people. So what do readers get from reading about super persons? Now, obviously, super persons can be really fun to read because Sherlock Holmes is one of the most popular books of, I won't say of all time, maybe of all time, I don't know. But they're really interesting to read just because they're just, well, first of all, it's just fun to read about a character who's just really good at something, right? Especially like mystery things where like things are purposely withheld. It's like, oh, how is he going to figure it out? Like the conflict in the story is not like, oh, will he figure out who killed the person? It's like, it's Sherlock Holmes. You know he's going to figure it out. But the joy comes from like, oh, this guy's a smart guy. How is he going to do it? Oh, he did it this way. Oh, that's so cool, right? So like, just like how it's fun to inhabit that character as a writer, because like, oh, I get to like have these like, fantasies about like being superpowered in that sense. Readers like the same thing. Like readers like to read about Sherlock Holmes, solving any case. People like to read about or watch like James Bond making like impossible like car maneuvers while he's shooting and stuff like that. Like, people generally enjoy it so long as it's well presented. We'll talk about the how they present a little bit more in a nuanced fashion. But in general, people enjoy watching people do things what they're good at. That was a weird sentence, but I think the message was conveyed. This is going to be something I'm going to talk about in a little bit further. But another reason people might enjoy this is watching a dichotomy between someone's ability and someone's limitation. So, for example, probably one reason why Sherlock, the BBC Sherlock, is so interesting to watch is that we love all the original aspects of Sherlock Holmes, of the person just being like hyper brilliant. Like, we like watching someone again who's good at something doing what they're good at, but we also like to watch that in direct contrast to something else, right? So in this case, like social ineptitude or like lack of knowledge in specific areas, which isn't as big of a flaw, honestly. But it's just interesting from a reader and a consumer's perspective to watch that conflict. We can try even applying that contrast to different characters just to see that how fun that might actually be, right? So for example, imagine, again, we talked about Aragorn just being the best at everything. Let's imagine him just being super socially awkward, which would also be canonical, right? It would almost be canonical because he was a ranger, right? He didn't talk with that many people, really, for a while. It would be really funny to watch, not funny, it would be really interesting to like have that, like, oh, like, you're so, you're very wise, you're able to fight, and he's just like, when you're like, oh, like, Aragorn, that was a great fight, sir, you did really well, and he's just like, thanks, I cut things. That would just be like just having just that image in my head it makes me chuckle. But yeah, it's like having that contrast would be kind of, more interesting, right? So again, people like seeing that contrast because that's just people like complexity. And another thing is you can have more than one super person, especially if they're on opposite sides. So for example, again, taking another thing from Sherlock, I guess it'd be more like Sherlock, the actual BBC one. So for example, Sherlock is a Superman in terms of analysis. Moriarty is a super person in terms of, first of all, protecting himself, right? And also just manipulation, right? Being able to tug on the heartstrings and stuff like that. That's a really interesting conflict, right? So like, it's the idea of like the immovable rock versus the unstoppable force. It's just interesting to see them collide, right? Just because, again, contrast, but also just like watching two people who are really good at what they do, trying to out-super person the other, is also just really interesting to consume and read and watch and all that fun stuff. So we talked about from the writer's perspective, we talked about from the reader's perspective, so what does having a super person do in terms of narrative and story and stuff like that? So as I mentioned in terms of the writing, so this is going to be a little bit of an overlap, is having a super person in terms of knowledge helps you convey information, right? Having a super person in terms of overpowered ability is a nice way to show contrast between the superhuman ability and the standard. So you can also have just like having super persons instantiate very specific things to help progress plot. Because they are really great plot progressors. So we talked about, again, different aspects of it. Let's talk about reservations about using a super person. I already did talk about some of this a little bit before, but if you have a super person who's just good at everything, it's going to get a little bit boring after a while, like especially if you don't have any nuance or contrast or anything like that. Like if the entire Lord of the Rings franchise was about Aragorn just fighting people and never getting hurt, you're gonna get bored, right? Like, oh, he's up against 30 orcs. Oh, they're dead. Oh, here's 37 orcs. Oh, they're dead too. Oh, they're flying. He stabbed them somehow. Cool. Like, oh, there's an elephant. Oh, you killed the elephant too. Actually, I don't think he killed an elephant in the book or in the movies. Anyway, it's a little boring, right? Like, because there's nothing to really have payoff, right? It's like, oh, you just did this cool thing. Oh, he did, like, so again, the first couple times, maybe, right? Like, oh, like, did you see, like, how he, like, wiped all of them out? It's like, oh, you did the same, oh, you did it again. You did it again, and again, and again, and again, right? It gets a little bit boring. Now, one thing that Conan Doyle did was having very different circumstances. So you can have the same super person, but in different circumstances, can change things up. So let's add some nuances to this archetype, right? Now, if you just have a character who's really good at one thing, and the plot is about that one thing, right? Now, you can make that okay by changing certain things, right? So if you think about Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, he's really good at this one thing, but he's put in different circumstances and all that fun stuff. That's enough of a difference that we don't get bored of him solving things. Another thing you could do is have the protag, or have the super person, not the protag. So if you think about again, Aragorn in Lord of the Rings, it's really about it's really about Sam, which is but it's about like the destruction of the ring, which Aragorn has very little influence over the actual directly during the books, right? Or at least the films. I haven't read the books in a while, right? Because if Frodo was like, I am like a super athlete with great endurance, I'll never be corrupted. I'm just gonna run in there, slay all the orcs, and then toss it in. Actually, got a weird image. I'm gonna like do this thing with the ring from that famous salt person, and watch the ring roll off into the lava and have it be destroyed and be done. The Lord of the Rings were really boring. So like so the tension is like, will the ring be destroyed in time? We know it's gonna be destroyed because we just know it is. But it's like, all right, so like, will it be in time before we lose maybe a protagonist that we do like? And so especially in terms of the knowledge one. So I mentioned that having an overpowered character in terms of knowledge is super, super useful, right? Because you're able to plug in or fill in some plot holes, maybe if there wasn't enough information or something like that. But have that person be either wrong about the information, super biased about the information, or they're leaving out crucial pieces of information. So for example, if your character who's like the source of knowledge, right, so the overpowered character who, maxed out knowledge, is super racist, and either doesn't care about like the other races in the world, or even thinks of them as lesser or something like that, the narrative that they tell may not be factually incorrect, right? So they may tell you like the major points, but it's gonna be super biased, right? And that will be really interesting to have that contrast, right? So like, oh, like I learned about, I guess to take American history, because why not? Andrew Jackson, like, oh, he was a charismatic leader who was the average person's man. And then that's all you were taught, like in high school. That's all you're taught. And then you learn like, oh, he was a terrible person, to the point that I don't even want to make these points because it's just like legitimately terrible how terrible a person he was. Like his treatment of Native Americans, his treatment of people who just who disagreed with him. Like those things should have been mentioned, right? But because your source of knowledge was super biased, you're not going to get those pieces of information. But it'll be really interesting when the characters learn pieces of information that they were directly withheld, because that's going to first of all like show color that character, so color the source of knowledge character a lot more, and also it will show more about the world, right? Because if you have only one source of knowledge, it's boring for you as a writer, it's boring for your readers, it's boring for the narrative perspective. But if there are these layers, right? Again, your source of knowledge is biased for some reason or another. Maybe he or she only cares about like the nobility or the kings, and doesn't care about farmers who were taxed out of their land or something like that. That's really important. Or someone who is more interested in economics as opposed to the welfare. All these different things. Like you can tell a story that isn't wrong from that biased perspective, but if you have those layers, right? So again, a character learns about these other things, a lot more interesting, and adds texture to not just your to your story, but also to your world building. A side note on that one is, if you have a source of knowledge character, have them lie. Have them know what's true, but they deliberately withhold or lie to the character so that they do what they want. Another thing you can do is attack the trope, right? So maybe like invert the trope in some perspective, right? Because what I mentioned before was, in general, characters who are super people don't have that much of a character arc. So have them change, right? So either have their super ability either diminished, have it no longer relevant, have it not as important as their deficiencies, and have the deficiencies be the places where you have the character arc, right? One thing that I will note is be careful about the limitations that you impose. Again, our purpose as storytellers and novelists is to make the world better than we left it. You don't want to write the novel that causes more harm than good to a community. So for example, I'm thinking specifically about physical disability, mental health, race is another one, and also sexual orientation is another thing too. Like, all of these things, keep them in mind that they're very, 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 very easy to get wrong. And it's very easy to cause more harm than good. So the biggest thing is, like, if you do want to have that happen, make sure you talk to someone from that community, and I'm sure someone will reach back out and like, yeah, like either, yeah, you're good, like you're approaching this well, or they're like, so this thing that you mentioned, although it happens, it's a really sore subject for like most of us. So that's just something to really keep in mind, especially if you're writing the other. So if you're, again, writing about, a race that isn't your own, or an orientation that isn't your own, or physical or mental ability that isn't your own, be very, very careful about that. And again, you want to make sure that you're making the world better from your storytelling as opposed to worse. So I know that's a little bit of a Debbie Downer, but keep that in mind. So I'm going to do this fairly seriously, just because it is something to keep in mind. Again, having a superpowered character is not in itself bad. It's not in itself good. It's really how you use it, right? So again, we've talked about a couple ways you can integrate it into your story, again, with those nuances that can kind of make them a little more compelling. Again, making those contracts, putting those limitations on them, and all that fun stuff. But let's talk about a few drills that you can play with this, right? So what I would like for you to do is take a superpowered character like, Sherlock Holmes, Aragorn, James Bond, or whatever, or someone that's another character that you want to do, and add different limitations that would really change the course of the story, right? So for example, if you want to take, again, just because this is, for some reason, this is the character I've chosen for this video, Aragorn, have Aragorn who is sympathetic with the orc cause, right? So maybe he has like a moral dilemma of like, okay, they were, bred for this, they were mind washed to, just fight us. That's kind of sad, right? So you're fighting people who probably have the ability to have more free will, but they were mind washed, they were, like literally from inception forced to do battle. So have Aragorn have that moment of that moral tension, right? Like, I need to protect my friends. I really feel bad about these, these orcs who, were forced to do this, who were brainwashed to do this. So you have to have that, that conflict. Or, again, take, maybe a knowledge character, so maybe like Hermione Granger from Harry Potter, and have her completely inept in certain versions of magic, right? But certain versions that are actually important to the story. Like, no one cares, like, if Hermione Granger doesn't know calculus. Like, that's not going to help anything. Versus, like, if she has, like, absolutely no knowledge in maybe, like, current events and stuff like that, because maybe she might have all the power in the world and all the knowledge in the world, but she doesn't know, like, the social context of something, she can do the wrong thing. Another thing you can do is, again, take an archetype and just smush it with something else, right? So someone who, like, just for example, let's combine the archetype of, obviously, the superpowered character with the reluctant hero, right? So someone who's like, yes, I have the ability to, you know, stop all this evil, but my bed is so comfortable. I don't want to leave it. I won't leave it. Right, so that's a little bit on the silly side, but you can combine several different archetypes and kind of see what happens. Taking the worst from both sides, right? So like maybe the arrogance of someone who is superpowered in something, and also the supreme laziness and maybe the awareness of, you know, other people's perceptions of that person from another archetype. And lastly, think about how you can change someone's overpowered characteristic halfway or even like a quarter into a story, right? So for example, if someone is, again, like just because swords, if someone is a really good swordsman and then like, you know, a quarter through the story, his or her lateral meniscus in their left knee suddenly explodes and they're no longer able to do any certain shoulder rolls or anything like that, figure out how he or she, completely hypothetically, would get better and still be able to do swordsmanship and all that fun stuff. But with that, so again, make sure you know the limitations. You're not going to be harming any communities and stuff like that. So do your research, but just be aware of the abilities of this archetype and see how much fun you can have with it. But with that, make sure you stay safe, stay humble, and keep writing. Have a good one.